19% of you said that the background was the most challenging part of your colored pencil piece. And 54% of you responded with this answer: what? I need a colored pencil background? To me, these results say that the majority of you feel that you either don't know how to implement a background or don't understand the role a background plays to some degree or another. In this video, I will be showing you how I built up the background in this floral piece. And while I do that, I'm going to be sharing 7 super actionable tips that you can use for your next blurry background. Tip number 1 is to start with good reference material. If you're working from a photograph, a quality photograph is key to your success in your blurry background. When I select a photo reference, I'm looking for 3 main things. I'm looking for clarity in my photo. So when I zoom in, can I see all the details? I'm looking for a strong, clear light source. So I ask myself questions like, are there light shapes and shadow shapes? Are they interesting? And finally, I'm looking for an interesting composition. I want to make sure that the way that my subject is presented is interesting. When I'm going specifically for a blurry background, I am taking into consideration my focal area and making sure that there is a focal area in the photograph. When I took the photo for this piece, I was actually using my iPhone. So that's proof that you don't need any expensive fancy camera. I took my iPhone, I tapped on the screen, and I made the camera focus on these flowers in the foreground. Then when I did that, it sent the background out of focus and I was able to capture a photograph that made the background blurry for me, which is a great place to start. Tip number 2 is to apply a base layer that unifies the entire piece. When I selected this photo to draw, I knew that I was going to have a really fuzzy, out of focus background and that I would be handling it in a very different way than I would the foreground. I wanted to explore different mark making strategies and different media in the background, but I didn't want it to feel so separate from the foreground. So I started my entire process by laying down a base watercolor layer that would unify the entire piece. When I applied this watercolor base layer, I didn't get into all of the individual color modulations. I really just used yellow and pink in varying values to lay in a general map of the composition. I then actually blended it out with water to really soften the edges, and so I started the entire piece with this really soft unifying base layer. Tip number 3 is to map in the details in the focal area before working on the background. Creating a fuzzy or out of focus background is all about establishing a visual hierarchy. And a visual hierarchy starts by knowing what your focal point is. For this piece, the focal point is definitely the yellow flower. And that means that the yellow flower is going to have the hardest edges, the most detail, and that the value shifts are going to be the most intense. As I move out from the flower, the edges are going to get a little softer on the petals. The value shifts are going to be a little less intense, but it's not going to be a drastic jump. Then when I leave this flower grouping, it is going to be my least important area where the edges are going to be the softest and the value shifts the least intense. Knowing and understanding this visual hierarchy is incredibly important, but seeing it throughout the process is crucial. Before I ever came into the background, I mapped in my details, my shadows, and my initial color impressions to the foreground. This gives me a point of reference and knows how detailed those areas are going to be, so I know how soft and out of focus the background needs to be. Mapping in these details doesn't require that you get the colors perfect or that you get that final sheen and that final texture. It's really just about making sure that the clarity is there and you know where you're going. Tip number 4 is to experiment with media that creates soft edges effortlessly. If you didn't already know, a hard edge is a crisp division of 2 shapes. So this is one shape crisply and definitively next to another shape. In this composition, the hard edges are found in those petals and shadow shapes in the foreground. In contrast, a soft edge is found between 2 shapes that do not have a very clear distinction. Often soft edges allow a shape or a form to blend into the background or to fade out entirely. In this composition, the background is filled with soft edges. The sharp point of a pencil does not make it the ideal medium for rendering soft edges and fuzzy out of focus backgrounds. You probably already know this, but colored pencils really shine when it comes to tight, crisp details. But that doesn't mean that you can't use colored pencils for an out of focus background. It just might mean that you will have an easier time if you allow the colored pencils to play with other mediums. So for this piece, I looked at mediums or media that would help me create those soft marks. I started with watercolor pencils and I created more structure on that initial watercolor underpainting. These watercolor pencils are Museum Aquarelles by Caran, and they are definitely some of my favorite watercolor pencils. They lay down really smooth color that becomes even more vibrant when you add the water. For this piece, I am using a 12 by 16 inch piece of Derwent Lightfast paper. This paper is specifically designed to be used for colored pencil, but it's a hot pressed watercolor paper, which means that it is also going to be compatible with your wet media. If you just start throwing wet media on this paper, it is going to buckle, so it's crucial that you start by actually stretching out the paper first. That isn't something I'm going to dive into in this video, but if you would like to learn how to stretch your watercolor paper, let me know and I can include that process in an upcoming video. Watercolor and watercolor pencils are great for creating soft edges because they can easily be moved around and manipulated with water and a brush. But powdery media are great for this as well. So after I let those watercolor pencils dry, I started playing around with pan pastels. Tip number 5 is to focus on abstract shapes. Whether it's the background or the foreground, it can be really challenging to separate from what you're drawing or to think of drawing a flower without thinking about the flower. But when you do this, you can trick your brain into seeing the shapes without seeing the actual subject matter, which can make your drawing more accurate. This is especially true for this out of focus background that we don't actually want to resemble flowers too much. We want it to look like flowers that are out of focus. So instead of trying to draw a flower, I focus on the shapes. If you're having a hard time focusing on shapes and you keep seeing your subject matter, you could try flipping your drawing upside down. Something about looking at a photo reference and your drawing upside down really forces your brain to think about shapes instead of what you're drawing. Another thing that you can do is to describe the shapes that you're seeing in different terms. So when I'm looking at this petal, I might say, oh, that petal looks like a lemon that's been squished, or it looks like a triangle that is leaning to the left or to the right. Sometimes using language, even if you're just talking or thinking to yourself in your studio space, can really help you break out of thinking about these as the object. Here I am using a soft tool sponge to apply pan pastels over the top of my watercolor pencils. And while I'm doing this, I'm just focusing on shapes. I'm not thinking about flower petals or full flowers. As I apply the pan pastel, I'm doing so very lightly. I want to keep this pretty thin because I'm actually planning to come over the top of it with colored pencils. And if I apply too much, especially on a smooth white cotton paper, I'm not going to be able to get the colored pencils to stick. So if you use pan pastels on a smooth cotton paper, use it sparingly and use just what you think you need. Once I started working with the pan pastels, I realized that the watercolor pencils probably weren't necessary, but they did help me build up the shapes and structure, and they were fun to work with. But I did probably add more steps to this background than I actually needed, and if you wanted to shortcut it, I would probably cut out the watercolor pencils. In the beginning of this video, I mentioned that there are many different kinds of backgrounds and different considerations that you should make when you're selecting what background will work best for your piece. If you would like to learn more about backgrounds, be sure to tell me about it in the comments and ask me specific questions that I can answer in upcoming videos. Additionally, if you have been enjoying the content in this video so far, I would love it if you nudge that like button. Your engagement through likes, comments, and shares tells the YouTube algorithm to share this video with more artists. And I would really love as many artists to benefit from the hard work that goes into these videos as possible. Thank you so much for your support. Tip number 6 is to build up the focal point in tandem. Once I completed the pan pastel layer, I had my background nearly complete, but I needed to see how it worked with the foreground. And at this point, the foreground was way far away from being complete. So I started at the edge, those edges that were connecting the foreground to the background, and I started building up towards that final polished sheen. Once I had a couple petals all the way completed, right next to the background, I could start reading how this piece was going to work as a whole, and I could start making decisions with how I was going to finish up the background. Tip number 7 is to unify the background and the foreground so that the piece works together as a whole. As I built up those first few petals, I quickly realized that the waxy sheen on the foreground was in stark contrast to the matte pan pastel background, and I didn't want them to be that separate. So I decided that the pan pastels were going to need a little bit of colored pencil over the top so that the final sheen or texture was going to be consistent throughout the entire piece. But as I already mentioned, colored pencils are not necessarily the easiest tool for achieving soft edges. So I was very careful and very intentional with my colored pencils. Some of the things that I did to maintain those soft edges were to apply gradations of color over edges. So I might start on a petal and then I would drag the color on that petal past the edge a little bit, lightening the pressure as I moved away from the edge. And this created a gradation that kept that edge really soft. Another thing that I did to keep my edges soft was to blend them with mineral spirits. Blending with mineral spirits is a way to separate the pigment in your pencil from the binder, which allows it to move around a little bit. Depending on your surface, it might move around like paint, but on a white cotton paper, it typically doesn't move around a ton. That being said, it did play nicely with the pan pastels that were underneath, and it did help me maintain more softness in my edges. And finally, I applied transparent glazes of color that helped unify areas. So if the shapes of the petals started feeling really separate, I would go over an entire area with a thin transparent glaze of color that would help unify that area and soften up some of the edges. I am really happy with the way this piece turned out. I feel like the soft edges that I worked so hard on in the background allow the background to recede without distracting the viewer from the focal point. And the focal point, or these foreground flowers, are really what this piece is all about. Well, that's all for now. Thank you so much for watching. Now go have a beautiful and creative day. See ya.